Alrighty, so we're ready for Lecture 6. So the United States has become independent. They've tried one form of government that didn't work, got rid of that, starting with another form of government. And from our perspective, it seems obvious that it's going to work. That makes it difficult to understand exactly how anxious people were in the late 1780s about whether or not they're going down the wrong path, whether the American experiment is going to survive. So at the end of April, like April 30th in 1789, George Washington became the first president under the new Constitution. He is the only president to have or to win every electoral vote. According to legend, if it looks like any other person is going to win unanimously, one elector is supposed to throw away their vote. So that way no one will ever top Washington, allegedly. Not sure if that's true, but it's a cute story. Washington's inaugural speech said that the whole destiny of liberty and free government depended on making this experiment successful. Washington and most other political leaders, national political leaders, believed that that success depended especially on keeping an even keel. They are terrified that disharmony and disunity will break the nation apart. And Washington, in particular, was anxious to keep political parties from forming. He believed that political parties were divisive and disloyal. Now, the Constitution doesn't mention parties. And like we talked about last time, the original method of electing a president assumed that candidates would run as individuals, not on a party ticket, the way they do today. But even by the time Washington took office, several states had political parties. That kind of happens naturally when you've got a group of people who share common interests and common beliefs about how government should function. Washington wants an age of harmony. But instead, the early republic was really almost torn apart by these parties. Each of them accused the others of being ignorant or traitors or just downright evil. Washington was a much-needed symbol of unity. And he's kind of the only symbol of unity that everyone feels like they can rally around. After the war, Washington had retired to private life, even though some of his officers, like Hamilton, had begged him to set himself up as a dictator, essentially. When he refused to do that, the people looked at Washington and said, oh, okay, he's self-sacrificing, he's not power-hungry, so that makes him a safe person to put this power into the hands of. They felt that with Washington as president, the nation could be stable. And Washington chose some of the most brilliant men of this era to work with him in the government. John Adams was his vice president. Jefferson was Secretary of State. Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. Knox, the guy who had gotten the all of the cannon out of Fort Ticonderoga, he's the new Secretary of War. So it looked really good. But the unity didn't last. Tension started almost immediately over Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton's plan to get the U.S. out of debt and onto a good financial foundation. Now, Hamilton's immediate goals were to stabilize the economy and build up American business and encourage development, but his long-term goal was to make the U.S. a major commercial and military power. He wanted the U.S. to be like Great Britain. So immediately, he's got enemies. Even if the different steps of his plan had absolutely nothing controversial in them, the end goal, make the U.S. a power like Britain is, would have turned people off. Now, there were 5 parts to his plan. Part 1, you've got to prove that the U.S. is creditworthy. The government needs money desperately. And so Hamilton wants people, wealthy businesses, maybe other countries, to loan money to the government to kind of help it along. But no one will loan money if they don't think they're going to get it back. And the U.S. was bankrupt. So to prove that the U.S. government was a good bet, was a safe place to loan your money, Hamilton said that we must prove we are credit worthy by paying off our debt. That is, how you build good credit, right? You prove that you can pay off debt by actually paying off the debt. So Hamilton said, we've got to pay off all the national debt from the Revolution, and maybe we should go ahead and pay off all of the debts of the individual states as well. Since we formed this new government, which calls itself a nation, instead of a firm league of friendship among the states, if we're going to be a nation, then maybe each state's debt is the nation's responsibility. So that's step one, prove that the U.S. is creditworthy. Step two, he wants to get the money to pay that debt off by issuing interest-bearing government bonds. We still do this. You can still go to the bank and get it. Most regular people buy EE bonds, and that is you loaning money to the government. If you buy an EE bond right now for $25, you are loaning the government your $25. And when the bond matures, then you can cash it in for twice the face value. You can do that individually in small amounts, or if you're an extremely wealthy person, or you're a bank, or you're a foreign country, you can buy U.S. government bonds for millions of dollars. Hamilton believed that if wealthy men, if businesses, and if foreign countries were allowed to loan money to the United States, that will make all of those people and businesses and countries invested in whether the U.S. succeeds or fails. You're not going to loan money to someone and then make sure that they can't pay it back, right? You're not going to invest in a business and then try and drive that business into the ground, except maybe for tax purposes. But, under normal circumstances, if you loan money to someone, you want them to be successful so they can pay it back. You want them to have a stake in, or you want to have a stake in their success. And Hamilton wanted all of the people who loaned money to the U.S. to really be invested in making sure that we succeed. So that's step two. Issue these interest-bearing government bonds. Step three, to handle all this financial stuff, Hamilton wants to create a national bank. He called it the Bank of the United States. Now, don't get confused. The Bank of the United States no longer exists. So if you're driving down the street and you see First National Bank, it is not what Hamilton's talking about. If you see U.S. Bank, it is not what Hamilton is talking about. The First Bank of the United States only existed for 20 years. The Second Bank of the United States will only exist for 20 years, and neither of them exist anymore. Now, this First National Bank, the First Bank of the United States, it was supposed to be a private, profit-making corporation. It's not going to be answerable to the people. It won't have any kind of democratic oversight. But it will hold the public funds. All of your tax money would be deposited into this private bank. Then the bank was supposed to print the official currency so that everything would be nice and tidy and we wouldn't have, each individual state with its own stupid 7-shilling currency. Having a national currency meant that money would spend no matter what state you were in. The Bank of the United States was also supposed to make sure that we were making payments on the national debt and make loans to the government itself if that became necessary. So that's step three, starting a national bank. Step four, Hamilton wants to tax whiskey producers because there's a lot of money involved in that. And step five, he wants to encourage American manufacturing. And the first way he wanted to do that was to have a tariff. Now, we've talked about tariffs before. That's that tax on imported goods. You tax imported goods so that it becomes too expensive to buy imported. You have to buy American. Hamilton wants a pretty high tariff. Hamilton also wanted to encourage manufacturing by giving government subsidies to people who want to build factories and start businesses and give them tax breaks. And we still do parts of that today. So that is the fifth and final part of Hamilton's plan: encourage American manufacturing. Now, Hamilton's plan had a lot of support among bankers and manufacturers and merchants, but small farmers and even some big plantation owners were not quite so keen on this. And Hamilton's ideas are based on the British system, and a lot of people really don't like that. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in particular believed that the future of the United States lay in westward expansion, not in looking back at what Europe does and trying to copy that. Jefferson and Madison and their followers are really not that interested in manufacturing and in building cities, and they're very opposed to building a government around the interests of bankers. Jefferson and Madison wanted to create a nation of independent farmers and small producers, and they really don't like tariffs. Tariffs on manufactured goods tend to hurt farmers, so they don't like that. Jefferson and Madison talked a lot about free trade, where American farmers would have open access to the world market. Jefferson in particular was very suspicious of a government that he felt was too closely aligned with big business. He just outright said that Hamilton's plan was a threat to freedom. And then Hamilton said, well, we're doing this so the U.S. can be a strong military power just like Britain. And Jefferson flipped his powdered wig over that. Jefferson opposed a lot of the plan in its individual steps as well. He thought that the different parts of the plan were flawed. So like the first part, you pay off the government debt, Jefferson opposed that. Now, he did have a logical reason for opposing that. He's not against paying off debt in general, but he's against the way that Hamilton wants to handle the government debt. During the war, during the Revolution, Congress had gone bankrupt. So they'd given the soldiers vouchers instead of actual money as payment. So they'd given basically IOUs. But the soldiers couldn't spend their IOUs. They can't use these IOUs to pay off their debts or keep their families from starving. So what would happen is wealthy speculators would go around to the army camps and they would buy these vouchers for a fraction of what their face value was. And the soldiers are desperate, so they sold them because, you've got a voucher for $100, but it's not actually worth anything right now. You can't spend it. But if the speculator is willing to give you $10, that's $10 that you can send back home and your family can stay afloat. So a lot of the war debt was actually being held by these private speculators. And Jefferson said that if the government is going to pay off the national debt, the money ought to go first to the soldiers. He said that if we pay off the national debt, by paying it into the hands of the men who hold those vouchers, then we are essentially rewarding those men, those speculators, for preying on U.S. troops in their time of desperation. And he said that's a really bad precedent to set. We don't want to do that. So if we're going to pay off the national debt, we ought to pay the soldiers the full value of the vouchers they used to hold. And then if those soldiers want to give their $10 back to the speculator as a thanks for helping during the war, then the soldiers individually can do that. But the government shouldn't reward these speculators. Jefferson also opposes paying off states' debts because Virginia, his state, had already paid off its own debt from the war. And the people of Virginia didn't see why they should be taxed to pay for, like New York or Massachusetts, to pay off their war debt. Hamilton's whiskey tax, that also bothered people, especially farmers. Because transportation was so bad, many farmers out in the frontier found that it was more efficient for them to distill their grain into whiskey. and that would make it easier to transport to market, and whiskey also sold very well, better than grain did. So when Hamilton wants to specifically tax whiskey, it looks like he's putting an extra burden on these guys who live in the frontier, who are already usually small farmers, who already lack access to really lucrative marketplaces, who are already kind of struggling. It feels like this is an extra tax just on them, which it is. At first, most of Hamilton's opponents came from the South. The South didn't have much interest in manufacturing. Its economy was almost entirely agricultural. There weren't as many people that the government owed money to in the South compared to in the North. And so they really feel like this whole plan is not something that's going to benefit them. And they also, particularly Jefferson, say that a lot of this plan is unconstitutional. Jefferson has this theory of government that today we call strict constructionism. Strict constructionism. A strict constructionist like Jefferson believes that the different branches of the government should only do what the Constitution explicitly gives them permission to do. And a lot of Hamilton's plan is not explicitly condoned by the Constitution. The tariffs, yes. The Constitution says that Congress can regulate trade. So Jefferson doesn't like the tariffs, but he recognizes that it is a constitutionally legitimate part of this plan. However, taxing whiskey specifically, and the government can tax, but Jefferson feels like it's sort of fudging to tax just one thing. So he doesn't like that. He says that's not constitutional. The Constitution doesn't specifically give Congress the power to create banks. And so that second part of the plan, the third part of the plan, the national bank, Jefferson says that is unconstitutional because the Constitution doesn't say that you can do it. Paying off states' debts, Constitution doesn't say that Congress can do that. Issuing government bonds, Constitution doesn't say that Congress can do that. So yeah, basically the only part of Hamilton's plan that is constitutional from Jefferson's perspective is that tariff. And all the rest of it, 4/5 of it, Jefferson says is unconstitutional, and therefore Hamilton can't do it. Hamilton obviously has the opposite perspective. Hamilton has a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton says that there are two clauses in the Constitution which give Congress the power to enact his plan. The first is the preamble to the Constitution, where it says that the role of the government is to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, ensure the blessings of liberty, blah, 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 but especially promote the general welfare. There is also a clause in the Constitution, it's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says that Congress may pass all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its role. So Hamilton says the Constitution says that the role of Congress, the role of government, is to promote the general welfare. And the Constitution also explicitly says that Congress can pass all laws necessary and proper to carry out its role. All of these things, Hamilton says, all 5 steps of his financial plan, are necessary and proper to promote the general welfare. Therefore, shut up, Jefferson. This is totally constitutional. Now, Jefferson, because he's part of Washington's cabinet, and Hamilton is a part of Washington's cabinet, and Washington is kind of like, guys, you know how we said we have to be careful about disunity? We want to make sure everything's on a good, even keel. You guys sniping at each other in the newspapers over this plan is not keeping things on an even keel. Maybe you should fix that. So Jefferson and Hamilton worked together to come up with a compromise. Jefferson got Southern politicians to support most of Hamilton's plan, everything except government subsidies to manufacturers. He got Southern politicians to support most of Hamilton's plan if Hamilton would support putting the new capital in the South. When Washington took office, he took office in New York City. Washington, D.C. didn't exist yet. But Hamilton said, all right, I'll make sure that the capital of the United States is built in the South, and in exchange, you will stop opposing most of my plan. So they did that. They built the capital city on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia, which are southern states. This may seem like a lopsided compromise, like Jefferson's giving up an awful lot of his principles in exchange for where a city is going to be built. But Southerners hoped that by keeping the capital in their own territory, it would make them more powerful. And also that it might make it harder for Northern politicians and Northern bankers to influence the government. Remember, this is the time when you can't just shoot off an email or a text to your congressperson. You had to send letters, and those letters had to go by horseback. So now, with the capital straddling the border between Maryland and Virginia, Jefferson has much quicker access to the capital than Hamilton from New York does, way more than somebody up in Vermont does. So Washington, D.C. is built on this river. It was designed by a Frenchman who was a veteran of our Revolution, and it was surveyed in part by Benjamin Banneker. And most of the work of building the new federal offices was done by slaves. So that first divisive issue is solved. But these two guys still hate each other, and the tensions are definitely still boiling underneath. They surface again over the French Revolution. Now, France had helped us in our revolution. And then a lot of those guys go back home. They realize that their government has not been handling things very well, and they want to start a republic. Now, when the French Revolution started in about 1789, most Americans had supported it. But within a couple of years, by the early 1790s, the French Revolution had become very radical and extremely violent, like more than ours was. The French executed their king, they executed the queen, they executed a whole bunch of nobles, they threw the Marquis de Lafayette, the guy who was essentially like Washington's adopted son, who had provided so much help for our revolution, they threw him in prison. And then they started in on what we call the Reign of Terror, where just about any critic of the revolution could be executed. Sometimes revolutionaries would execute other revolutionaries just because they couldn't agree on what to do next. It's getting very chaotic, and elite politicians, no matter where in the world they are, they really don't like chaos. And so the U.S. is kind of like, oh, this is getting nasty. We don't really like it that much. And then Britain decides to take advantage of this. Britain and France have been rivals for centuries. Britain is still really PO'd that France helped us in our revolution. So now that France is in a weakened state with no real functioning government, Britain declares war. And that created a lot of conflict over here. Jefferson and his followers thought that the French Revolution may have gotten out of hand, but it's still a good thing. At the end of it, there will be another free republic in the world, and so we still ought to support it. They pointed out that France had given us a great deal of help in our own revolution. We ought to be grateful for that. And of course, there's still a lot of resentment toward Britain. So when Britain declared war on France, it made a lot of Americans even more pro-French, just because they're sort of anti-British by default. Now, on the other side, you've got Hamilton and Adams and Washington. They all believe that the French Revolution has gone too far. It is too violent. It's beginning to look too much like anarchy. They don't want to have to choose a side. But if it comes down to that, they might jump to the British side instead. Now, the U.S. had an alliance with France. We had formed that after the Battle of Saratoga back in '78. Nobody wants to break that. But also, nobody really wants to get dragged into this fight on either side. Not even Jefferson really wants to get involved. We've just finished getting out of a war, right? I mean, it's not even been a solid decade since the treaty ending the revolution was signed. And also, we've just got this brand new form of government. We don't want to break it. We're not actually sure if it can survive a war, so we'd prefer to stay out of it. In 1793, Washington said that the U.S. was officially neutral. We are not getting involved. Almost immediately after he said that, popular French leaders started coming to the U.S., tried to persuade U.S. soldiers and sailors to join them in their fight against Britain, and that just made Washington look kind of stupid. I mean, he'd given this big old speech declaring neutrality, while behind his back, U.S. sailors and mercenaries were rallying to support France. Britain looked at that and said, wow, so the U.S. has totally lost control of their people. I guess that means that we can start taking advantage of that now. And they do. They seize hundreds of American trading ships. They also start doing this thing called impressment. Impressment means if they found any American sailor on a U.S. ship who they could say had been born in Britain, they would kidnap him and force him to serve in the Royal Navy instead. And they impressed an awful lot of American sailors. Washington sent John Jay. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Jay had also been involved in negotiating the treaty that ended the Revolution, so Washington sent John Jay to London to work out a deal to get the British off our backs. But the deal that Jay came up with caused more problems. He couldn't get the British to agree to really anything that we really wanted. He couldn't get them to agree to stop kidnapping Americans. He could not get them to agree to respect American shipping rights. The only thing that they would agree to do was leave their forts and their trading posts out in the Ohio region, which they'd already promised to do in the Treaty of Paris. So they promised to do it once, and they didn't do it. Now they're going to promise to do it again. We're pretty sure that they're not actually going to do it. Spoiler alert, they are not going to do it. To get that one little tiny agreement that Britain is not even going to honor, the U.S. agreed to give the British favorable trading treatment and essentially cancel our alliance with France. Now, critics of this, like Jefferson, complained that Jay had betrayed our French friends, had aligned us with Britain for nothing. By the mid-1790s, there are two major political parties in Congress, and they sort of coalesce around pro-French, anti-French / pro-neutrality forces. They call themselves the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, when we talk about the Democratic Republicans, some students are going to want to shorten that to the Democratic Party, and other students will want to shorten that to the Republican Party. Neither of those is correct. This is the Democratic Republican Party. It is a completely separate thing. Our modern-day Democratic Party and our modern-day Republican Party do not exist at this point. This is a completely separate thing. Both of these parties accuse the other one of trying to destroy liberty and freedom and democracy. Now, the Federalists are officially led by Hamilton, but Washington, even though he hates political parties, most of his beliefs align with what Federalists believe. Federalists tend to support Hamilton's financial plan. They tend to support Jay's agreement. They know it's not perfect, but they think it's the best thing we can get right now. And they tend to want closer ties to Great Britain. Most Federalists are big merchants, big northern landowners, lawyers outside the South, bankers, manufacturers. They're often very elitist. They have that very traditional view that society ought to be stratified, that it ought to be a hierarchy, and that the upper classes ought to control the government. Hamilton called these men the rich, the able, and the well-born, which is slightly ironic because he himself was not well-born. But Hamilton believed that freedom meant obeying authority. He said that freedom doesn't mean that you have the right to protest against the government, which is really frickin' ironic because that dude had served in the Revolutionary Army. It's okay when he does it. It's not okay when you do it. Federalists in general were afraid that all of this liberty stuff had just gone too far. They're the only major party in U.S. history to just outright say that democracy is dangerous if you give it to regular people. They pointed to things like the Whiskey Rebellion, when backcountry Pennsylvania farmers refused to pay the new tax on their whiskey. The rebels said that tax was an infringement on their liberty. So Washington sent a 13,000-man militia led by Hamilton to put down that rebellion. Now, on the other side, you've got the Democratic Republicans. They're led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They support France. They had a lot more faith in the common man. They said they had a lot more faith in the common man and in democratic government, but understand most of the Democratic Republicans are slave owners. So who counts as the common man is extremely limited. The supporters of the Democratic Republicans were made up of kind of an uneasy alliance between big Southern plantation owners and small farmers, and sometimes city laborers. The men who employed those laborers, the business owners, tended to be Federalists, but the workers themselves were most often Democratic Republicans. They are very critical of inequality among white men. They support a broad democratic participation among white men. They said that only letting the wealthy participate was the real threat to freedom. Now, both of these parties believe that they are the best representative of the country. They both believe that the other party is nuts and dangerous. The Democratic Republicans accuse the Federalists of saying that regular people were stupid, which, fair enough, they did kind of say that. Federalists accuse the Democratic Republicans of wanting to be tyrants. Not entirely sure how that was going to happen. The Federalists called their opponents traitors and anarchists, and tyrants at the same time, which are totally opposite things. They accused Jefferson and Madison of being French agents in disguise. The Democratic Republicans said that Federalists were trying to reinstitute monarchy and corruption, and both sides accused the other of being traitors to the nation. These debates produced one of the worst periods of political warfare in U.S. history. But they also helped to expand the public sphere, expand participation, because one thing that happens when politics gets really nasty is people take an interest. It becomes entertaining all of a sudden. So more and more people went to public meetings, read political newspapers, read political pamphlets, trying to find out what's going on in all of these squabbles. The number of newspapers doubled during the 1790s, and then quadrupled again by 1810. At this point, basically any man who could write a little bit could write a pamphlet and get it read by somebody. These men form political organizations. They start holding debates. Most of these men are Democratic Republicans. They believe that the government is destroying the promise of the revolution. They believe that the few are taking power from the many, and that the many need to rise up and take it back. Opponents of these Federalists, of these elitists, found about 50 Democratic Republican clubs. Now, the Federalists look at all of this activity among the hoi polloi, among regular folks, and say, oh, democracy has clearly gotten out of hand. Now, the clubs defend themselves by saying that the right to speak and argue was the first line of defense against tyranny. They said that political freedom isn't just voting at the polls. It's being constantly engaged. It's being informed. It's keeping an eye on the government to make sure that it's doing what's right. And they said that it doesn't matter what your social status is, you have a responsibility to know what's going on and to make your voice heard. The Democratic Republicans also got a lot of support from immigrants. We weren't getting a huge amount of immigration during this decade, but most of the ones that we did get were dissenters from the British Isles. Because Britain was at war with France, Britain had cracked down on its critics. And so those critics came to the United States with a whole bag full of complaints that they are only too glad to share. Thomas Paine was almost arrested in Britain for criticizing the way that the British government was handling the war. And he had to flee the country and come back to the U.S. One step ahead of the law. A lot of British radicals, a lot of Irish radicals came to the U.S. Many of them had been journalists who had been accused of treason by the British government. So once they get here, they have a lot to say about tyranny, about freedom. And all of this democratic fervor, all of this talk about liberty and the rights of the people, started to inspire women's rights activists. In 1792, an Englishwoman named Mary Wollstonecraft published a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Wollstonecraft began by saying that natural human rights were in fact for all humans, and not just the male ones. She was careful to not challenge the most sacredly held gender roles. It's going to take a long time to do that. Instead, mostly her book argued that by allowing women to become educated, by allowing women to work outside the home, sign their own contracts, control their own wages, run their own businesses, that would make them better wives and mothers. Wollstonecraft is a part of this sort of Republican motherhood idea that we talked about a couple of lectures ago, that women will raise better citizens. They will raise their sons to be more informed, more responsible, more the kind of people that you want in charge, if they have the opportunity to be educated and active and informed themselves. Wollstonecraft also said that women ought to be represented in government, but she wouldn't quite go so far as to say that women should be able to hold office. Not quite that far. With the public sphere expanding and with everybody trying to make their voices heard, in this moment it opened up a little bit of space for women too. They went to debates. They usually didn't speak at these debates because that would have been indecent and scandalous. They read newspapers. They went to listen to speakers. They wrote a lot. That wasn't scandalous. Judith Sargent Murray wrote essays for the Massachusetts Magazine in favor of education for women and for women to be allowed to develop their abilities. She said that men seemed to enjoy saying that women were intellectually handicapped, but that was only because most women hadn't had the chance to develop themselves. Now, these women's rights activists pointed out that the Constitution does not explicitly bar women from voting or holding office. Until after the Civil War, the word male didn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Women counted toward seats in the House of Representatives, they counted toward votes in the Electoral College, and there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly bars them from participation. But the men who wrote the Constitution, Hamilton and Madison and those guys, they didn't really imagine that women would want to or be capable of being involved in politics. But the rise of the parties trying to mobilize voters and this stirring of women's activism and even armed uprisings like the Whiskey Rebellion helped to more democratize American public life. In 1792, Washington won unanimous re-election, so he's going to serve a second term. But then he decided that was it. He retired from public life after his second term, in part to set an example for future presidents. And until the 20th century, no other man tried to run for more than 2 terms as president, because you're not supposed to outdo Washington. In his farewell speech, Washington defended his administration, his choices, against critics. He warned against the party system, and he advised the nation to steer clear of any international entanglements. When Washington announced that he was stepping down, it unleashed this whole flurry of competition over who's going to take his place. The election of 1896 was the first contested election, the first time where there was really more than one choice for voters. John Adams ran, Jefferson ran. Now, we're still not running on political tickets, right? So even though John Adams represents the Federalists, he's not running on a Federalist political ticket. Jefferson, everyone knows, is aligned with the Democratic Republicans, but there's no DR ticket. Now, at this point, there are 16 states, and in 6 of them, the voters get to choose their own electoral college. In the other 10, the state legislature would choose. So effectively, in those states, the state legislature would choose who would be president, and the voters just voted for fun. But in the 6 states where voters chose their electors, intense campaigning took place. Adams got 71 electoral votes. Jefferson got 68. Now, Adams had a guy that he wanted to be his vice president, but in 1796, you didn't run on a ticket. First place becomes president, second place is vice president. So in the election of 1796, the U.S. had a president and a vice president who are of different parties and who despise each other. It's sad, really. Like back in the Revolutionary days, Adams and Jefferson had been really good friends, but all of this conflict over the proper use of government had torn them apart, and they'll both be really old men before that rift is healed. Now, John Adams is a brilliant man, intellectually brilliant. But his personality was maybe not best suited for this position. He's stubborn, he's prickly, he doesn't take criticism well, and you know that the president is always going to cop a lot of criticism. Adams described himself as obnoxious and disliked. So even if his term as president had been completely smooth and there'd been no crises to deal with, he would probably still have had trouble because that's just kind of Adams. And unfortunately, his term was just overwhelmed with problems that the government doesn't really know how to deal with at this point. The U.S. nearly got dragged into the war between Britain and France. The U.S. is still officially neutral, so we're still trying to trade with both of those countries. But both of those countries would hijack American ships. In 1797, President Adams sent some diplomats to Paris to try to negotiate a treaty with the French to at least get them off our backs. But before they would even start negotiations, French officials demanded a bribe. They wanted to be paid more. They're already being paid by the French government. Now they want the U.S. government to pay them to sit down and talk. Adams was infuriated. That's extremely unethical. And so he made their demands public. But he wouldn't let them publish the names of the French officials. Instead, they were called X, Y, and Z. And the XYZ affair poisoned American relations with France. By 1798, the U.S. is in this quasi-war with France. We haven't declared war, but French ships would seize American ships wherever they could find them. The American Navy would take out after the French and try and get them back. So the U.S. has essentially become an ally of Britain without declaring it and without really meaning to. Adams finally negotiated peace with France in 1800, shortly before the next presidential election. Now at home, Adams has trouble too. There's a lot of tension in domestic issues. The rural areas, the farming districts, continue to be very unhappy. Congress had passed a tax on land and houses to try to fund the Navy so we could fight this quasi-war. Well, in 1799, farmers in Pennsylvania decided that they were going to stop the tax assessors from coming onto their property to revalue it and raise the taxes. It was kind of like Shays' Rebellion was back during the Confederation days, where they tried to shut down the courts so they couldn't issue any foreclosures. Now, in this Fry's Rebellion is this one. These guys say, well, they can't raise the taxes if they can't see the property, so we're just going to round everybody up and we're going to block all of the pathways onto the farms, and then they won't be able to value the property. A group of men were arrested, and a crowd led by John Fries released them, and Adams sent the army after them. They arrested John Fries and the rest of the leaders. They whipped newspaper editors. They tore down the old Liberty poles. But the biggest crisis that Adams faced was over the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. The Alien and Sedition Acts. These are kind of complicated, and the response to this is kind of complicated. Federalists want to silence their critics, Federalists including President Adams. Congress is Federalist, so they pass these series of new laws. One of them is a new Naturalization Act. Naturalization is the process where immigrants become citizens. Originally, you only had to be here for 5 years. An immigrant only had to reside in the United States for 5 years before they could become a citizen. This new law extends that residency requirement. Now, immigrants had to live here for 14 years, so they almost tripled the residency requirement. And why would they do that? It's because most of the immigrants coming in were Irish or English radicals. They tend to support the other party. They tend to support the Democratic Republicans. By extending the residency law, the Federalists are deliberately trying to keep this population of opponents from being able to vote. And then they passed a new Alien Act. The Alien Act allowed the government to deport immigrants who now have to be here almost 3 times as long before they're citizens, allowed the government to deport immigrants if the authorities thought they might be dangerous. But the Alien Act didn't specify what it meant by dangerous, so some Federalist officials cast a really wide net and started rounding up and deporting just about every Democratic, Republican-leaning immigrant that they could find. Then Congress passed the Sedition Act. Now, the naturalization law, the alien law, these are against immigrants. But then the Sedition Act focuses on citizens. The Sedition Act allowed the government to prosecute almost any publication or public assembly that criticized the government itself, the mechanisms of the government, or individuals who worked for the government. Now, that meant that editors of newspapers or publishing houses could be prosecuted for almost any political comment that they printed. And the main target was, of course, the Democratic Republican press. The Federalists said that they're stirring people up and they're fomenting rebellion. Well, about 18 people were charged under the Sedition Act. Most of them were convicted of spreading scandalous and malicious information about the government. One of the people prosecuted and convicted was a member of the House of Representatives, Matthew Lyon. In his day job, he ran a newspaper. He got hit with a $1,000 fine, and that's, 1790s, $1,000. That's close to $100,000 in today's terms, and 4 months in prison. Lyon was a former indentured servant who had gotten himself free and raised himself up, and he really hates the old elites. And so he criticizes them, and he got his butt thrown in jail for that. The government also imprisoned Thomas Cooper, who was a doctor from Pennsylvania. He had accused President Adams of having a pro-British bias, which is absolutely true. But under this law, something being true doesn't mean that you can't be punished for saying it. Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts were meant to silence critics of the Federalist government, but it didn't really work. For every newspaper that they shut down, a new one started. People were talking about freedom of speech and freedom of expression and how far you ought to be able to go with it. And Jefferson and Madison led the opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. They wrote resolutions, anti-Alien and Sedition Act resolutions, and shopped them around the different state legislatures until they found a couple of states that would actually pass these resolutions. Both of the resolutions attack the Sedition Act as a violation of the First Amendment. Madison wrote the resolution that was adopted by Virginia. So the Virginia Resolution. That one said that the federal courts ought to step in to protect speech, that the federal courts ought to protect people's First Amendment rights. Most people could get behind that one. Jefferson wrote the other resolution. That one will be adopted by the state of Kentucky, a fairly new state, and that one went even further. And in fact, the original version that Jefferson wrote was quite scandalous in exactly how far he was willing to go. In the original version of the Kentucky Resolution, Jefferson said that states should nullify, or refuse to obey federal laws that the states feel violate the Constitution. That one was so out there that the Kentucky legislature deleted that section before they would pass the rest of the resolution. So the nullification idea wasn't in the final version of the Kentucky Resolution, but people remembered it. And 30 years down the road, another lawmaker named John Calhoun will use that nullification clause to argue against other federal laws. Calhoun led what will be called the nullification crisis of 1832. He will say that Jefferson said that states should not obey laws that they felt were unconstitutional. Eventually, Calhoun and other Southern leaders will take it even further. They'll say that Southern states should have the power to nullify Northern states' anti-slavery laws. So the Sedition Act in the 1790s will lead to the Kentucky Resolution. And that nullification clause in the Kentucky Resolution will help to push the U.S. towards civil war. Now, Kentucky and Virginia were the only states that adopted these two resolutions. Most Americans, including most Democratic Republicans, were horrified by the idea that a state might endanger the Republic by refusing to obey laws. But the crisis surrounding all of this strongly reinforced the idea that freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and discussion were necessary for American liberty and democracy. And the broad revulsion against the Alien and Sedition Acts will help to propel Thomas Jefferson to the presidency in 1800. Now, Jefferson and Liberty was the slogan of the Democratic-Republican campaign in 1800. By this point, the Democratic Republicans have developed some really good techniques for getting out the vote. They print pamphlets and handbills and newspapers. They hold mass meetings and public debates. The Federalists, who believe that politics should really only be for the elite, they had kind of a hard time getting regular dudes to support them. But the Federalists still dominate New England, and they have a lot of support in the sort of the commerce-oriented middle states. Jefferson won 73 electoral votes. Adams got 65. But before he could take office, Jefferson had to deal with a constitutional crisis. Number one candidate is president, number two is vice president. But in this election, neither party wanted to end up like the last one, with the president and a VP of different parties. So both guys, both Jefferson and Adams, had chosen the person that they want to be their vice president, and they had made a deal with the electors for their party that they will cast all of their number one votes for the main guy. Democratic Republicans will cast all of their number one votes for Jefferson. Federalist electors will cast all of their number one votes for Adams. and they will cast all of their number 2 votes except 1 for the second guy. For the Democratic Republican Party, that means all of the electors will cast their number 1 vote for Jefferson, and all but 1 of their electors will cast their number 2 vote for a man named Aaron Burr. The guy who does not cast his vote for Aaron Burr will just throw his vote away. That's the way it's supposed to work. So Jefferson is supposed to get 73 electoral votes, and Burr is supposed to get 72 electoral votes. But the designated Republican elector didn't follow the plan. So both Jefferson and Burr got 73 electoral votes. Now, when that happened, under the old rules, the House of Representatives was supposed to decide. But the House of Representatives is still majority Federalists. The new House has not taken their seats yet. And the Federalists who are in the House of Representatives don't like Jefferson or Burr. They vote 35 times. And each time, Jefferson and Burr get an equal number of votes. Finally, Alexander Hamilton had to step in. Now, he is a Federalist. He hates Jefferson. He kind of likes Aaron Burr. They've been friends for a while. They were young lawyers together. They traveled the legal circuit together. But he doesn't trust Aaron Burr. He believed that Burr was obsessed with power and would screw up the entire country. So he sided with Jefferson, a man that he absolutely despised. And with Hamilton's support, that tipped the balance. In February of 1801, Jefferson finally won the House of Representatives' choice for president. Now, mind you, we didn't have like a designated election day back then the way we do today. So some states had actually held their elections in April of 1800. So for them, this election has been going on for 10 months. Now, Congress decided that this whole election process was nuts. So they passed a constitutional amendment to fix it. They passed the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment basically says that president and vice president run together on a ticket. Now, this election, the outcome of this election, also worsened the feelings between Hamilton and Burr. They will become very much not friends over the next 4 years, and eventually Burr will kill Hamilton. And then Burr went on to prove Hamilton right by trying to start his own country with himself as the king. Now, the events leading up to this election, the events of the 1790s, had showed that a majority of Americans believed that ordinary white men had a right to be involved and make decisions in politics. But more importantly, as nasty and contentious as the election of 1800 was, and it was very nasty, one pro-Adams advertisement said that if Jefferson elected, you would see female chastity violated, dwellings in flames, and children writhing on a pike. So yeah, it was pretty nasty. But once the election actually took place, it was a peaceful transfer of power. To their credit, once the Federalists realized that they had lost, they did not challenge the election results. Once it became clear that some Democratic Republican is going to be president, that was it. Adams didn't try to block Jefferson from taking office. He didn't try to raise an army. And keep in mind that at this point, the U.S. has only ever been under Federalist control. This is the very first election where one party is being asked to hand over the reins, and they did it. I mean, think of other countries where if the ruling party loses the election, they will call in the army and they will declare a state of emergency and dig in for like 30 years. That's never happened in the U.S. No matter how much we might dislike an elected official, we usually transfer power peacefully. Now, the issue of slavery was a major factor in this election. Jefferson is a Southern slave owner, and he received every electoral vote from the South. And if it weren't for the 3/5 compromise, the South would not have had enough electoral votes for him to win. So the issue of slavery still won't go away. Events during the 1790s underscored how powerfully slavery distorted Americans' understanding of freedom. Jefferson and his followers had loved the French Revolution, right? That said it was a step in the universal progress of liberty, even though it had gotten nasty and violent. But in 1791, slaves on the French island of Saint-Domingue began to rebel. Toussaint Louverture, he was an educated slave on a sugar plantation. He rounded up a bunch of slaves and sort of forged them into an army, and they defeated the French militia there. Then they defeated a British army that was sent in to take them. Then they defeated part of Napoleon's own army. That slave uprising created the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere, the nation of Haiti. Now, the Haitian Revolution inspired hopes of freedom among American slaves. They used the language of the Enlightenment and classical liberalism. They called for their natural rights. But to Jefferson, and to most white Americans, the Haitian slaves were not men and women fighting for their liberty. They were dangerous. They were a threat to America. Jefferson, who had supported the French Revolution no matter how out of control it had gotten, did everything that he could to stifle the Haitian Republic, right down to eventually forcing the new Haitian government to sign an agreement saying that they would pay France back for the loss of its property. The property that France has lost is themselves. It's those people. So these people have fought and defeated 3 separate armies to win their freedom, and they will still have to pay money for their freedom. Haiti will continue to pay off the debt for their great-grandparents' freedom until the 1940s. And if they start to fall behind, the U.S. on 3 separate occasions sent our Marines into Haiti to force them to continue paying that century-old debt to France. So if you've ever wondered why Haiti is so incredibly impoverished, that's a huge part of it. Now, the year 1800 had this electoral revolution, but it also had an attempted real revolution, a plot by slaves in Virginia to gain their freedom. And a lot of it is based on this growing Haitian Revolution. The rebellion in Virginia is called Gabriel's Rebellion. It's organized by a Richmond blacksmith and his brothers. They planned to march on the city of Richmond with an army of slaves from the surrounding plantations, and they were going to hold the city hostage until slavery was abolished by the state of Virginia, preferably by the United States as a whole, but they'll start with Virginia if they have to. Now, Gabriel believed that poor white people would join them because he felt like they were all being kept down by the planters. So he ordered his followers to not kill anybody, especially make sure that they're being peaceful toward Quakers and Methodists, because those 2 churches were the most vocal against slavery. But the plot was discovered because the roads that they planned to march on were washed out by this unexpected storm, and 26 slaves, including Gabriel, were hanged. Now, in 1800, when this rebellion started, black people made up about half of Richmond's population, and about 20% of them were free. That free black community had grown up in the 1780s and 1790s during that brief period we talked about after the Revolution, where slaves had fought in the war and so won their freedom, or sometimes were voluntarily set free. And this conspiracy was rooted in that free community. Gabriel gathered his recruits at Black Baptist churches and barbecues and other gatherings. And in cities like Richmond, sometimes skilled slave craftsmen were able to read and write and were able to rent themselves out. They could perform paid labor and then save that money up to buy their freedom. So they had a certain degree of autonomy, even if they were slaves. And that helps to account for how big this rebellion got before it was discovered. Gabriel's rebellion was a product of this whole era. Gabriel himself was born in 1776. He was born with the nation, he liked to say. And like every other Virginian, Gabriel and his fellow conspirators spoke the language of liberty. They made banners saying liberty or death, like Patrick Henry had said. One of Gabriel's followers said that Gabriel was like Washington. He is leading his countrymen to freedom. These people speak of their right to freedom. They say that the Virginia government or the U.S. government has no right to infringe on their freedom. Of course, Virginia continued to just infringe away. After Gabriel's rebellion was discovered, Virginia tightened their controls once again over their black population. They made it illegal for free black people to congregate on Sundays without white supervision, and they tightened any loopholes to freedom. Any slave freed after 1806 was required to leave the state or be sold back into slavery. I mean, that's a law that Virginia had back in the early 1700s before the Revolution. But the Revolution had changed things. It had opened the door. But now that door to emancipation is being slammed firmly shut once again. Okay, we're going to end this here at kind of the halfway mark, and then we're going to talk about the rest of it in a different video.